Okay, thank you. Well, in my talk I will try and, in some respects, respond to Pete's invitation to think historically about some of the context for debates about social change, social sciences, and the impact of social sciences. One thing which isn't clear from my title is the fact that I'll really be focusing upon the UK, not because I think the UK is somehow exemplary, because I think there's a really interesting comparative analysis to be done of ways in which different kinds of social science methods develop and proliferate in different nations, different parts of the world. But because I think it's in some ways a spectacular case of the impact, historical impact of the social sciences in quite a short period of time. And I want to try and talk through with you some of those issues. Reflections from a number of things. I mean, as Pete mentioned, I was involved in CRESC. We have a cross-cutting theme of research on under the title of the social life and methods. Myself, I'm still involved. John Law, the Open University, Egan Ruppish, the Open University are the main conveners of this theme. And we're interested in the issue about kind of how social science methods have some kind of agency. They're not just means of rendering the world, they actually have certain implications, they do things. They have certain kinds of performativity, to use the lingo. And we're pursuing that over the next 4 years within CRESC, and I'm part of those discussions. I'll talk about I will try and raise the issues from my recent book, which again Pete mentioned, which trace back how we can understand social change in post-war Britain, thinking about using the methods of social scientists as our way into those discussions. I'm really intrigued by the fact that social scientists, particularly sociologists, actually often talk about massive change, huge epochal changes taking place, but they rarely put themselves in that picture as agents in those processes which they're describing. So trying to think about how we might develop a nuanced account of social change, actually putting the social sciences at the heart of the analysis. And along the way, I want to try and my interest is partly about thinking about how these are different ways of rendering the world, if you like, rendering the social world. A social network diagram, a sociogram, which proliferate today. And if you look at any web source, you'll see these things jump out at you. They have a particular history, and they have a particular way of understanding what it means to be a social agent and to be part of society. This is a piece of work which I was involved with colleagues like Tony Bennett and Alan Ward with the Silver, which is a way of rendering survey data. Sociologists, as I'll talk about in a minute, have been very influential in developing the repertoire of the sample survey. How do we use the sample survey to comprehend, perform society? And so I'm interested in the kind of devices which social scientists have developed and the way they've acted on the world in various kinds of ways. Okay, just want to begin. I mean, when Peter asked me to think about talking, I thought, well, where do I stand on impact? So let me just begin with a very simple heuristic model, which is derived really from Stephen Lukes' very old book on Power, A Radical View. But he talks about 3 kinds of power. Well, apologies, this is a very crude take on it, but you might say there's perhaps 3 ways to think about impact. I'm sure there's more than that, but here's 3 ways which occur to me. In which you might say social science research has some kind of impact. And of course the first 2 of these are the kind of things which you might see as being particularly relevant to the way in which Hefke are thinking about impact. But I would try and argue that we really need to move to number 3 if we're going to have a more developed approach towards impact. So Stephen Lukes famously says power exists on the first phase of power when actor A make something happen over the wishes of actor B. And you can find various examples in the world of social scientists being involved in those discussions and having an influence, say, on government policy, in various kind of formal committees. That's a fairly straightforward way of thinking about impact. It's the way in which political scientists can readily explore. A bit more complex and a bit more troubling in some ways for the impact agenda is number 2. When Lukes talks about the way in which things are kept off the agenda because they trouble that agenda. And of course the history of academic activity and certainly social scientific activity is lots of examples of the way in which social science research is kept off the agenda because it disrupts powerful agencies and the way they think about things. A particularly important moment in the UK was the election of the Thatcher government in the late 70s, which saw a whole series of ways in which influential advice given to them by social scientists was basically ignored and marginalised. Committees were closed down. The Black Report on health inequalities being the most famous example. But again, it's important, and it poses a challenge to ref writing, for instance, when you say, well, we've had this hugely important research which has been sat upon. It's so good that the powerful figures don't really want to hear it. That's a challenge there. And that's something which we need to take out of. But I'm also interested in this number 3. Famously, Luke says power exists on this third face when people are so steeped in a certain way of thinking about the world that they don't realise there are alternatives, and they don't realise that their interests are being violated by not protesting about certain kinds of things. And in a certain kinds of way, you might say the social science research, as other kinds of research, is important in the way it seeps in to the social and cultural relationships in ways which may not be obvious, may not be easily detectable, but nonetheless they may have really very important impacts. And I'm mainly going to be talking about this level 3, but I think also it does incorporate aspects to do with this first and second phases. Now obviously, if any of you can think back to Stephen Lukes' book, you'll know it's very controversial. A whole series of issues are posed by it, because he talks about the way in which the third phase of power operates when people don't act in defence of their interests. Obviously that raises an issue, what do we mean by interests? How are we as social scientists to impute interests to people? Nonetheless, I want to try and sidestep those debates a bit, because I sort of think in order to understand the impact, we can reflect upon this question. Again, partly because of some of the debates we've had in Quest and the social life and methods, and some of the ideas that John Law brings to the centre with his interest in actor network theory. One way of thinking about the kind of impact which social science research could have is the way it gets instantiated in various kinds of devices. What is a device? It's a kind of instantiation, a materialisation of certain ways of doing research, of codifying procedures for understanding things and for ordering the world. Thinking about it in this way is interesting because I think that we then say that the social scientists are indeed competing with the natural scientists. The natural scientists are very good at developing devices, widgets of all kinds, and these have hugely profound importance. We social scientists don't tend to think about what we do in terms of developing devices or not developing devices, but actually if we think about what we do in those terms, then we can recognise that we are indeed in some kind of contested terrain in which we are competing with other interest groups who've got their devices which do certain kinds of things and make certain kinds of things happen. And although I'm not going to talk about this in great detail today, I think that leads us to suggest, and it follows on from the debate we had early on today, but actually a huge issue is the way in which natural scientists are increasingly intervening on the terrain of the social with their devices. This is very much facilitated by web technologies of various kinds. And I think in our debates, in our social scientific debates on impact, we have to be aware of that. Okay, so I want to think a bit about the social science device. And I really want to kind of really, very quickly rush you through a kind of story. It's a very simple story at one level. Hope it's not too crude, but about understanding the kinds of devices which social scientists have developed. And I really want to try and avoid the teleological view. Okay, actually, some devices fail. Some devices get marginalised. Second phase of power. Other devices come to have huge implications in ways which their developers aren't really aware of when they develop them. And it's interesting to trace through the unevenness of that historical account and recognising that it could have been different. There's no necessary way in which things have panned out. And I want to place that in terms of, I think this is a very interestingly British story about the post-war university. We all know that the post-war years have seen the dramatic rise of higher education in the UK. The proportion of students going to proportion of young people going to universities has increased from 1% to about 40% in a 50-year period. If you look back at the immediate post-war years, and still influenced by C.P. Snow's famous remark in 1959, which had a huge impact, if I can use that word, debated in the media about the divide between two cultures. And he meant by that the divide between the culture of the sciences and the culture of the humanities. So he was a novelist who was also part of the scientific establishment. And this has been much debated. He had no sense, in his account, just 50 years ago, about the social sciences and where they stood in these two cultures. Where do they stand? Well, in some respects, they stand between those two worlds. They borrow from those two worlds of science on the one hand and the humanities on the other. And that is, in a way, I think one of the very significant shifts in knowledge and expertise over the last 50 years, particularly in the UK, but not just in the UK, the way in which the social scientists have themselves, in a massively expanding higher education system, they have muscled into themselves the greatest share of activity, teaching, research within that structure. Just to give you a few examples, I'll talk about some of these in a bit more detail. I mean, I'm really interested in the way in which certain terms, certain common sense terms which proliferate, were actually elaborated initially by social scientists. Affluence was talked about by the famous radical economist J.K. Galbraith in the late 50s. Then it proliferated into debate about the affluent society. In the 60s, still talked about the notion of post-industrialism, which was led on to debates about post-Fordism and post-modernisation. Again, was developed by American sociologists like Daniel Bell from the early 70s. And perhaps the best example of all is globalisation. We're all globalised, aren't we? And yet that term was really championed very strongly by sociologists, people like Roland Robertson, not that long ago, 20 years ago, and it has come to have huge play. I mean, if you were to do a famous book by Raymond Williams, literary critic, Keywords, early 70s, which gives you a glossary of key ideas as developed in Britain before the 1950s. Most of those words are not words which social scientists help to elaborate. They're words from humanities, from philosophy, from religion. I think if you could do a contemporary keywords, it'd be interesting to trace through how many of those keywords come from the coining of phrases by social scientists, particularly sociologists perhaps. Then, something I'm going to talk about a bit more in detail in a minute, the way in which certain key devices for understanding the social were championed. And again, I think I'm really interested in the kind of, it's quite a short-term history really. These, in some respects, don't have a very long lineage, but they soon come to have a significant role in thinking about what it means to be in society, or how society is to be organised. And so I think Nigel Thrift captures this quite interestingly, this notion of knowing capitalism, that capitalism depends upon eliciting information about itself in order to function these days. And the social scientists have helped develop the devices which are part of that, of those circuits of knowing capitalism. As I mentioned earlier on, I think I'm sort of intrigued by the fact that, with a few exceptions, and I think this is an area which is changing quite fast, and I think many of us in Cresc are keen to pursue this agenda further. We're still not very engaged in thinking about ourselves as an agent in the social world, not as people who stand back from the social world and understand it, but actually as players in the world, as objects of research. A few exceptions, I think, Michel Callon and Donald Mackenzie's work on economics is very important, but economics, I want to argue, is actually, it's a peculiar science, it's a peculiar social science in some ways. And I think we shouldn't just take those ideas on the performativity economics and apply them across the whole spectrum of the social sciences. If you leave people like that aside, I still think within sociology certainly there's a strong tendency to kind of adopt a Whig interpretation of the subject. Certain forebears, it happens to be the census, Doomsday Book in some cases, Saint-Simon, Durkheim, Marx, Weber, etc. And these are then kind of just read back, and you read the present back into those genealogical forebears. And then there's strong internalist debates about how we should do the social today. Typically in sociology, at least, very strong internecine times conflicts between quantitative and qualitative, positivist hermeneutic researchers, as if those debates and disputes are somehow fundamental, and you don't always are aware of the congruences which you may have between those camps. I'm really interested in the way in which